Okay, I'm actually going to start now, if I may. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's meeting of the Tuxedo Park Stewardship Forum, where we will actually look at how gardens can be created to be beautiful and environmentally beneficial at the same time. The Stewardship Forum is a volunteer group set up to encourage the exchange of ideas and information that are important to the park and that will shape the future of our community. Our first meeting was in June this year at Tuxedo. The forum organizers are Michelle Lindsay, who is a member of the Tuxedo Town Board and chair of the Climate Smart Committee, Joanne Hanson, who is the chair of our planning board, and me, the author of the trilogy of books on Tuxedo Park's architecture, famous people, and landscape. The first book was co-authored with the late Christian Sani. Note that this meeting is being audio taped by our local media, TPFYI, and will be available on their website from October 18, when the editor returns from an overseas trip. For those people who are not familiar with TPFYI, there's a flyer on the table that you can get to look at their work. We're also being videotaped, and it will be the recording will be streamed on YouTube. Many people have contributed tremendously to make this day possible. We are extremely grateful to Cole Harrell and Tai Hun King for hosting this event at their beautiful house in the beautiful garden. I don't think we can have a better venue for our discussion today. Thank you. We're grateful for Simeri to lend us our mic system and for Pete Dados to be our technical expert. We're grateful for the Tuxedo Fire Department for this rather large television, which is straight from their common room. So we need to bring it back in one piece. We also thank Peter and Barbara Regner for adding to our convivial cheer with a gift of the Prosecco wine. Thank you. And we could not have this visual without the ingenuity of Christopher Gow for these beautiful real Burberry fabric. So turning to our discussion today, it is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Todd Forrest, who has the perfect last name to suit his eminent position as the Arthur Ross Vice President of Horticulture and Living Collections at the New York Botanical Garden. Over the past 2 decades, the New York Botanical Garden has restored some 150 out of its 250 historic landscape, while completely changing its gardening practices to balance beauty with environmental responsibility. Todd is the person who directs all the managers, curators, and horticulturalists to do this important transformation work. Prior to joining the Botanical Garden, Todd worked at the Arnold Arboretum at the Harvard University, and he received his master's degree in forest science from the Yale University School of the Environment. After Todd's presentation, we will reorientate ourselves back to Tuxedo and consider how gardening practices at the Botanical Garden can be relevant to our community. To help us to do so will be Joanne Hanson, who has studied the park's geography and site conditions during the years of serving on the planning board, and she will be sharing with us some very important data points and perspectives. Then Michelle Lindsay will take us into Q&A. As a small preamble to the presentation, I'd like to point out that that Tuxedo Park and the New York Botanical Gardens are actually cousins. The Laurelard family stuffed mill lies at the heart of the Botanical Garden and right next to the Bronx River, which flows through the Botanical Garden. In other words, the Botanical Garden is situated within the Bronx River watershed. Tuxedo Park is also in a watershed area. You'll hear a lot about this word watershed in today's presentation, so remember that. So without further ado, Todd, please share with us.
There are seats up front for those who can swing around this way, but there are a lot of seats if people would like to sit down, be a little closer to the slides. You can just...
This is a good transition time, so why don't we fill in some seats.
Peter? Maria, come up.
Yeah. I know you might feel that you're stuck if you're in the front seat, but we won't look askance as you have to get up and go and get some more crudité. So it's all good. We're friends. This is going to be a very informal presentation. It's going to be more like a conversation with me doing the vast majority of the talking. Okay. Well, thank you, Chu Yin and Michelle and Joanne, and of course Cole and Ty. I guess this place is it still called Hilldale? It was called Hilldale at one point. This is a beautiful.
Now we know it as Children's House from the war, but it used to be Hilldale.
It used to be Hilldale, exactly. Well, it's an absolutely gorgeous site, and Chu Yin and I did a little bit of a scouting mission maybe a month and a half or so ago, and we walked around this remarkable garden on a beautiful day, and what Cole and Ty are doing here exactly embodies what I am about to talk about in my presentation and my proselytization. So again, hi. Can you all see the screen? The most important thing about garden presentations is that you have beautiful pictures. So if you're bored by me, at least you can look at the beautiful pictures. What's great is that if you're bored by my beautiful pictures, you can look at Tuxedo Lake. And they've arranged some sort of regatta today, so there's going to be very lovely or romantic people kind of just gliding by and skulls. It's kind of a perfect setup. It's one that I can't screw up, and I appreciate that. Thank you, Chu, again, for giving me the chance to succeed. Okay, so here we go. We're going to leap right in. A little bit about me. Why would you spend a Sunday afternoon listening to me? I'm not exactly sure. But as Chu Yin said, so I've worked at the New York Botanical Garden for 25 years. This is my 25th year. And at NYBG, I have oversight over the entire horticulture operation, which is the care and feeding of the plants across a 250-acre landscape. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But my position at the garden is a function of a lifelong love of nature that I picked up in New Jersey, where I grew up. In New Jersey, I had to work hard to experience nature, and I did. And it's really guided my entire life. So I exist at a very strange intersection in my profession. I'm head of horticulture, and you'll see the garden has a very traditional set of horticultural offerings, but I have a deep commitment to nature and the environment. So in my professional work and in my personal life, I try to balance those two things, an appreciation for the art and history and culture of gardens and garden design, and the essential energy of life that nature represents. So that's where I'm coming from. So a little bit, have you all been to NYBG? Show of hands. A very sophisticated crowd here in Tuxedo Park. Excellent. So I can zip right through there. We're in the Bronx. We were established as an institution in 1891 by these two stern-looking people, Nathaniel Britton and Elizabeth Britton, who had been to the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, pictured here in the middle, on their honeymoon in the late 1880s. And they came back to New York City dedicated to creating a Kew for America, basically. So the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew is the sort of the traditional botanical garden. It follows a three-part mission of botanical science, education, and horticulture. And at the time, in the late 19th century, there really wasn't a similar institution in the US. There were several botanical gardens, but then none that had quite the reach and the gravitas of Kew. So they came back to New York, dedicated to create the institution. And they were successful. 1891, the NYBG was created by an act of the state legislature of New York. It was the third of the the many major cultural institutions created in New York after the American Museum of Natural History and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Like those institutions, we are a New York City cultural institution. Our land and buildings is owned by the city, but we're also a private not-for-profit institution that focuses on the display of plants and the research of plant science, and of course educating people of all ages. Again, more about that in a minute. The garden also was created at a time when in New York City, the city recognized that it needed a lot more green space than it had. We're in the Bronx, the northernmost borough of New York City. In the late 1880s, New York set aside about 4,000 acres of parkland in the Bronx. Most people don't realize that the Bronx is the greenest borough in New York. And they set aside that parkland because they recognize that not only do sophisticated cities need cultural institutions, they also need green space so that people can, live kind of the healthy and happy lives they need to sort of fuel the engine of commerce that was and New York remains today. So again, we are a traditional botanical garden at NYBG. That means we follow a three-part mission of botanical science, education, and horticulture. Our botanists are people who are first and foremost plant systematists and floristic botanists. What that means is that they study the plant biodiversity of the world, the plant and fungal biodiversity of the world, everywhere from the Brazilian Amazon to the South Pacific. We also have an economic botany program that studies the way people use plants for food, for medicine, for cultural purposes. And we have some modern lab science of molecular systematics and genomics. Our education program is the largest of any botanical garden in the world, and we have about 100,000 New York City school children who come to the garden each year to learn about plants and nature. We have a continuing education program in which you can learn anything you are interested in that has to do with the plant world, like however tangentially. You can learn botanical illustration, you can learn how to vegetable garden, anything about the world of plants that you want to learn, you can learn at NYBG. We have a School of Professional Horticulture, which is a 2-year program, so if any of you are looking to do a career change, become professional gardeners, you can come and learn how to do that alongside the amazing horticulturists who take care of NYBG. And of course, we have doctoral students and interns who work with NYBG scientists who get their degrees from one of 6 institutions, universities that we have partnerships with. It's Cornell, Columbia, Yale, NYU, Fordham, and the City University of New York. And of course, we have horticulture, which is what I am in charge of. And that's spread kind of broadly across 4 major areas. Natural areas, with a 50-acre old-growth forest at the heart of the garden. It was considered a miracle in the 19th century. You can probably imagine how much more of a miracle it is today. We have 50 gardens, collections, and displays spread across the 250 acres, everything from a rose garden to a rock garden to a native plant garden. More about that upcoming. We have a program of living exhibitions. How many of you have been to the holiday train show at the New York Botanical Garden? Right. How many of you went to the Burley Marx exhibition a few years ago? You guys have to get to the garden more. I take it back. You're not as sophisticated as I thought. And we have a program of community horticulture called Bronx Green Up, which is 35 years old this year. And basically what the folks at Bronx Green Up do is they take NYBG's horticulture expertise, our gardening expertise, and they share it with our neighbors in the Bronx, who are the most amazing people who have transformed vacant lots into productive urban farms and community gardens. Over the years, we've worked with about 300 different community gardens, urban farms, and school gardens. So that's horticulture. So, how many of you assume that I am a tree-hugging extremist? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I knew at least a few of you did. So I have to sort of set the record straight. I am a tree-hugging extremist, but I am also a person who really values and honors and is responsible for a suite of traditional horticultural activities that we hope engage and delight millions of people over time, right? So I've been at the garden for 25 years, but the garden has been around for over 130. And I love this quote, and I'm going to read it because you all might not be able to read it from the back. This is an op-ed in Garden and Forest, which is a short-lived but very fascinating magazine from the late 19th century, when Charles Sargent, who was the founder of the Arnold Arboretum, where I used to work, was writing about the choice of land for the New York Botanical Garden in the 1890s. And what he wrote is, no city in the world possesses more beautiful scenery or a park area more thoroughly characteristic of what is most delightful in the landscape of the part of the world in which it is situated than does New York and Bronx Park. That was the home of NYBG before it became NYBG. And then it goes on to say, the city spent money like water to create some charming natural scenery in what is now Central Park by blasting out ridges of rock, filling in the spaces with soil, and turning this desert of stone into a tree-flecked meadowland. Now that it has come into possession of scenery far more beautiful and ready-made, it would be folly to destroy it. This was the airing of a actual beef that Sargent had of the garden's founding director, basically saying, you've chosen the most beautiful home for your institution, don't screw it up. I like to think we didn't. And here I was expecting you all to be dressed like this today. I'm a little disappointed, I must say, or maybe Tuxedo Park is not what I thought it was. This is a group of women walking through the landscape that is now the New York Botanic Garden soon after it was chosen for the home of the garden in the 1890s. Actually, one quick thing, you notice that in this part that they're walking through, old meadows with a handful of mature trees, a very beautiful, almost agrarian landscape. But at the middle of that landscape was this 50-acre old-growth forest that has never been cut or cleared. A pretty amazing place. Like Tuxedo Park, the garden has changed a lot over time. We were founded to be 250 acres. We grew in 1915 to 400 acres. Then in 1937, we lost 150 acres due to the construction of the Bronx River Parkway. So we're back to our original size, but the garden doesn't include necessarily all the things that were there at the very beginning, but it does include the most important things, including that old-growth forest. So there it is. I'm going to go quickly again because I know some of you, at least two of you, assume that I am a tree-hugging extremist. To sort of set the stage for what NYBG is and how this combination, this overlay of nature, more beautiful than Central Park, and horticulture, this amazing tradition, kind of bring our program and our mission as an institution to life in 2023. So of course there is the 50-acre old-growth Thane family forest. We'll learn a lot more about that later on, but it was considered to be the most beautiful possession of beautiful natural possession in New York in the 19th century, and it's been preserved by our institution ever since we were founded on the site. And of course, the Lewester T. Morse Library, which is the home to the education and science programs. We have the largest plant library in one place in the world, an incredible collection of books. And this is really the only part of our landscape that is very formal. It's the Tulip Tree LA in front of this Beaux-Arts building, quite grand and quite spectacular. We're in the process of restoring our Tulip Tree LA, which would be a subject for a different presentation entirely, but something I've found very interesting. The Enid A. Hop Conservatory, the great Lord and Burnham designed glasshouse, completed in 1902. It's about an acre under glass. It's the largest Victorian glasshouse in North America, and it's home to our permanent collections of tropical plants, and of course our changing program of exhibitions, not just the Holiday Train Show. And of course our tree collections. The garden is a museum of plants. So when the garden was founded on the site, they preserved the forest. They started to assemble collections of trees and other plants from around the world for the purposes of study, of research, and of beauty. The oldest intact collection in the garden is the Ross Conifer Arboretum. Here's a grove of Tanyosho pines, which are quite amazing. These were planted in 1908. The Burke Oak Collection, also one of the original systematic collections laid out in the 1890s, was just restored last year. And oaks, of course, how many of you have read Doug Tallamy's book, The Nature of Oaks? They're the engines of life in nature in our climate. We have a wonderful collection of oaks that were planted, but we also have literally thousands of native oaks that predate the establishment of the garden in the 19th century. The Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden, how's that for traditional horticulture? Designed by Beatrix Farrand in 1915. Partially constructed in 1916, abandoned in the 1960s, and then finished, really, reconstructed in the late 1980s. I don't know if that's me or not.
No, sorry. Partner, let me sneak by.
Doesn't matter. I mean, I don't mind. Can you guys hear me if I just talk?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I'll
Just
do
turn
that.
it off, yeah.
So we can turn that off. Okay, the Peggy Rock, and I also am very comfortable shouting. The Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden is a classic early 20th century formal design. Like the Tulip Tree LA, it's one of the few parts of the garden that is very formal. It was designed to be a collection of roses, but also just a very beautiful rose garden. And we've transformed the way that we've taken care of that garden over the past 20 years. More about that. How about Daffodil Hill? So in the 1920s, we started planting daffodils in the southwestern corner of our landscape, and maybe 100,000 or so were planted over a few years in the 1920s. Over time, that part of the garden sort of was kind of quasi-abandoned, And in 2015, on the eve of our 125th anniversary as an institution, we started the process of planting 1 million new daffodils across that site. So we're about 500,000 daffodils into that process right now. It turns out that we probably don't have room for 1 million, but the good news is that every daffodil becomes maybe 3 to 5 daffodils over several years, so I like to think we've added 2.5 million daffodils to the site. An unbelievable, breathtaking experience, and usually about the 3rd week of April when it flowers. Our rock garden, another very traditional kind of horticultural intervention. This was created by T.H. Everett, who was my predecessor several predecessors ago. Who was literally the most knowledgeable. He was British. He worked at NYBG from about 1932 to the mid-1960s. And this rock garden is very much a kind of early modern Anglophile kind of paradise. Very traditional with plants literally from around the world. Quite beautiful in spring and in fall. Our lilac collection, which was restored in 2016, but includes about 150 types of lilacs, and towards the end of April and beginning of May, it's a magical place to be. Our perennial garden, designed by the great garden designer Lyndon Miller, who is a trustee of the New York Botanical Garden, which is a showcase of mixed border design. By mixed border, I mean it's called a perennial garden, but it has everything from bulbs to annuals, to tropical plants, to perennials, grasses, shrubs, and small trees. A garden with literally 4 seasons of beauty, something to see 365 days a year. The azalea garden, which opened in 2011, when we were designing this, we said we want a garden that can be seen from space in May. And we were successful. And in May, it is quite beautiful. It's clouds of pastel. This is my least favorite time of year in the azalea garden. This is a garden that's beautiful in February, where you really see the bones of the landscape. It is a remarkable and thoughtful use of space, just as this garden is a remarkable and thoughtful use of space. The native plant garden, again, we'll learn more about that later. It's opened in 2013, but it was built on the site of a garden that was established in the late 1930s to honor the work of Elizabeth Britton, who is one of the garden's co-founders, who also was an early advocate for the conservation of plants. Basically, she saw that the plants, some of the native plants in the forest, were going away because of human malfeasance, and she started arguably the first plant preservation, plant conservation society in the US, if not the world, based on that experience. The seasonal walk, Rosen Seasonal Walk, designed by Piet Oudolf, the great Dutch garden designer who's also famous for doing the High Line. And then the Edible Academy, which opened in 2018, which is really a kitchen and garden classroom where New York City school children come learn how to plant, tend, harvest, prepare, and eat healthy organic vegetables. This is for a population who is very disconnected from the production of food in the Bronx. A beautiful teaching garden. It also has a kitchen classroom. It's an amazing place. So that is the offering that we have at NYBG. Again, very little of that it necessarily requires tree-hugging environmentalism, a lot of traditional horticulture, and a lot of beauty. Beauty is our business in many ways. And tradition is our business in many ways. We work really hard to make the garden compelling and interesting. We have many historic designs, things that were thought to be all the rage in the late 19th or early 20th century, that may not be the sort of thing that's popular today, but they are part of our institutional heritage and our culture and our history. So we protect them and we celebrate them and we love them. And so that's where I come from. That's where I work. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how our approach to gardening at NYBG is evolving. Has evolved, I should say, but is evolving. And hopefully this will serve as entertainment, if not inspiration, for all you all. But we're going to start off by putting gardening as an activity into the larger environmental context. Quick show of hands, how many of you have gardens of any sort? Everybody, very sophisticated. How many of you think that your gardens are the most important part of the regional environment? Literally nobody. Okay, so we're going to change that today, or we hope we're going to try to change that today. Each of your gardens is the most important part of the regional environment in which it exists. The New York Botanical Garden is the most important part of the regional environment in which it exists. So this is an op-ed from the Washington Post earlier this year by Dana Milbank. And some of you might be catching wind that those of us who garden are catching flack from people who view gardens as a source of environmental degradation, right? It's kind of in the wind. People, when you have a lawn, they might think of you as just, I don't know, a rapacious marauder who's destroying the earth. If you have roses, the same thing. There's lots of people who just right now are putting gardens along with industrial pollution and large-scale development as a scourge of the earth. It really is something that's grown recently. I am the head of horticulture at the New York Botanical Garden, so I hear all of those same things. And why do people think that way? The reality is that most people's gardens, here's a picture of a garden right down the street from mine. I don't show my garden because my garden is like the cobbler's children. It's a little bit messy, it's very personal. NYBG is my garden. This is my neighbor's garden. It turns out, I did not know this, I took this picture of my neighbor's garden. It was the garden of the person who ran the garden club of our town for like 30 or 40 years. A very typical American garden. It's got a lawn, it's got some foundation plantings, it's got some shrubs. This is the way most gardens are. Very few gardens are like Cole and Ty's garden. How many of these are there? Well, this is a study from NASA, I think it was in 2005, looking at turf, basically grass, lawns across the US to see how much of our country was covered by lawns. And lawns are gardens, by the way. They're cultivated intentionally for purpose, so they're gardens. And so if you use lawns as a proxy for gardens, there's about 40 million acres collectively of gardens in the US. This is why your garden is the most important place for your regional environment, because your garden is connected to all of the other gardens which are connected to the larger environment. You are part of nature in your gardens. You are influencing nature in your gardens, and collectively, our gardens are really impacting nature across the US. So if you look at, and these numbers come from different places, they probably go up and they go down, but you're just trying to get a sense of the scale of what gardening is in our country. About 90 million pounds of fertilizer applied across those 40 million acres. About 75 million pounds of pesticides applied across those 40 million acres. About 3 trillion gallons of water. The picture, you can't really tell, this picture of gardens in Phoenix, Arizona, and if you look closely, it's just filled with lawns. Maybe not the best choice of a plant material for Phoenix. So you'll see that wherever we are, our gardens are having an impact, good or bad. Every one of us lives in a watershed. Do you all know what a watershed is? Okay, so we'll try to explain it as simply as possible. Wherever we are, if a drop of land falls at our feet, it's going to flow into a water body, a river or a lake, and ultimately work its way into an ocean. All of the land that feeds a given water body, I don't know, Tuxedo Lake, Little Weewa and Weewa lakes, is that what they're called?
Yes.
Right, okay. Literally, the drops of land that fall here or fall there are connected to the Tuxedo Lake watershed, et cetera. Which means that what we put in our gardens ends up in the water someplace. Even if we don't happen to have a home in a garden with such a beautiful view and connection to the water, our homes and gardens are connected to water somewhere. It's not just true in Tuxedo Park, it's true everywhere, all the time. So what does that mean? This is from a study in Minneapolis, which looks at the sources of pollutants in urban watershed. And don't worry about looking at all the bars, it's pretty interesting. But it turns out that within the watershed, nitrogen, which is a great cause of algal blooms, of pollution in watersheds, most of it comes from residential fertilizer. That's people fertilizing their lawns. This is Minneapolis. Phosphorus, also a great source of algal blooms and other water pollutants. One of the largest sources is actually from pet waste. You can imagine a scale in a city, people not managing pest waste properly. So the person who's walking his or her dog in Minneapolis is not understanding that they're having an impact on the watersheds of the land of 10,000 lakes. All that we do on the land where we live and where we play and where we work is impacting nature someplace. And of course, with gardens, it's actually a more profound impact collectively than I think any of us would have known before. So what does this mean? So I live in Connecticut. My watershed is the Norwalk River. The Norwalk River flows into Long Island Sound. Long Island Sound is a really remarkable estuary, a very beautiful and complex living system. If you look at this slide, you'll see the areas in red on the western edge of Long Island Sound, closest to New York City, experience hypoxia, which is very low amounts of oxygen in the water during the summer, generally, when temperatures are high, right? A lot of the cause of that hypoxia is an elevated amount of algae and other vegetation, which is spurred on to growth by nitrogen and phosphorus, which comes in part from our lawns and gardens. You see the impact of this over time in the Sound, and anybody who spends time in the Sound in the summer really sees the impact. And in fact, maybe about 15 years ago, there was an anoxic event where the Sound completely lost all oxygen in the Western Sound, and it destroyed a lobster fishery that had been in the Sound really since Europeans came here, at the very least. Okay, so we're looking at the things that people apply to their gardens, right? And so if you look, and many of you will go into, well, not you, but many people like you will go into a hardware store and buy a solution to a problem they perceive in their garden, right? And they'll buy something that might be crabgrass preventer, it might be weed preventer, it might be tree and shrub insect control, it might be a fungicide, right? What do all of those products have in common? They're designed to kill things. They're literally designed to kill things. It's just a simple fact about an herbicide or a fungicide or insecticide. Doesn't mean that they're fundamentally bad. It means that they're designed to do something. And so as we use them in our gardens and our lives, we have to understand they're killing, we hope, we're using them properly, we read the label, the thing we want to kill, but they're also maybe killing lots of other things. So before we use them, we ask ourselves the question, is this the thing that we need now? Is this going to do harm, or is this going to do good? And again, it was 75 million pounds of pesticides applied across the 40 million acres. It is a significant issue. It is a reality. Invasive species. Many gardens are responsible for the introduction of invasive species. Things like burning bush, which I saw kind of driving in, which is introduced as a garden plant. Things like lesser celandine, or things like porcelain berry, which has become the scourge of the New York Botanical Garden. All introduced as garden plants at some point. And over time, it's turned out that these are starting to have an impact on nature in our regions. When they were introduced, in some cases 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, the notion of invasive species was not something that people knew about or thought about. So nobody introduced these things with ill will. They were introduced because people wanted to make their gardens more beautiful and more interesting, and they've done that. But there has been an impact over time. And so, okay, just knowing that our gardening practices can have these impacts is the first place that we start to feel like, how can we make our gardens beautiful? How can we achieve everything that a garden achieves for us while doing no harm? So here we are. Again, what a wonderful place to have this presentation, because the link to the watershed is so clear. The link to the larger landscape is so clear as we sit here on this beautiful on this hill, this beautiful view. Tuxedo Park was formed by the Lorillard families, who, as Chu-Yin said, were living literally in the site of the Botanical Garden to sort of engage with nature in a profoundly kind of day-to-day way. It was an intentional move to a natural environment, right? How many of you moved here because it's naturally beautiful? Exactly. So you get where the Lorillards were coming from when they did this. They were looking for, in a way, escape from the expanding city. There's lots of reasons why you would choose to live in a place as beautiful as this one. And when it was established, it was probably run by a bunch of farms and hillsteads and forests and remnant forests and all of that. But nature was the thing that drove the creation of this space. they started making gardens right away. On the left, as you're looking at it, is Hilldale, is this garden. And on the right is what is called, I guess you guys call the poorhouse. And you can see a contrast in gardening approaches. Neither is necessarily good or necessarily bad, but a contrast. Very kind of grand, very European approach in poorhouse. And it's sort of a kind of almost more content. This garden could have been designed last year or 15 years ago, a sort of gardening with the nature element that was here. And again, it's so amazing to see how Cole and Ty have maintained that spirit in this landscape. So people came here for nature. They built houses, modest houses, not so modest houses. They built gardens, modest gardens, not so modest gardens. Not thinking that this all might one day have an impact on the nature that they were created, or that they came here to appreciate. And again, you'll hear more about this later, but we're in watersheds here. Of course, the watershed of Tuxedo Lake and Weewa and Little Weewa Lake, but then within the larger watershed of the Ramapo River, which apparently gives New Jersey a lot of its drinking water. So whatever your opinion is about people in New Jersey, what you do in your gardens is impacting people in New Jersey. And those gardens, of course, garden making continues to this day. This is Turtle Point, which is a really beautiful, interesting, and wonderful garden right on the water here in Tuxedo Park that was gardened by the Swansons. And I used to come visit it because a former colleague of mine worked here for a long time. So all of those big picture things that we were talking about that gardens do for the environment, of course, are happening here. So what do we do? Again, I don't love roses. I appreciate roses. I don't love rock gardens. I appreciate rock gardens. But I love the combination of art and science and diligence that it takes to make any garden beautiful and compelling. But I also love the planet. I love Earth. I love nature. I love being outside. And so as a gardener, I want to make sure that my love of gardens is not influencing the nature that I also love, that drew me to this career. NYBG is also in a watershed. Here you can see the Bronx River watershed. The Bronx River flows about 24 miles from the Kensico reservoirs north of White Plains into the East River, flows right through the middle of the New York Botanical Garden. So everything we do in NYBG is impacting the East River, is impacting New York Harbor, is impacting even the Atlantic Ocean through its impact on the Bronx River, which again flows right through the middle of our landscape. So what are we doing? As I stand here on my high horse and I try to convince all you all to sort of think about things a little bit differently, how is that thinking impacting what we're doing at NYBG? So I'm going to go through very quickly some operational details that we've been experiencing and that we've been implementing and experimenting with. And then I'm going to go over 3 projects, kind of larger scale projects that we've done with this combination between the beauty of horticulture, the history of horticulture, the tradition of horticulture, and the reality that our horticulture is connected to nature in a profound way. So the first thing we're starting to do is nothing. Pretty good. But if you guys are gardeners, you know that it's hard to do nothing. There's lots to do all the time. So that's a picture of clover in our lawns. This is being recorded, so I should probably not do this. But I had a boss for a long time who was a very traditional garden person, an Anglophile to the core. Everything is done better than England. We could never do anything as well in the Bronx as was done in England, and I was responsible for doing things not as well. One thing that used to really rub him the wrong way was when he'd be out and about, giving a donor, people like you, a tour through the place, and he'd be trying to impress, and there'd be some clover. You'd hear about that. I got to the point I used to advise my colleagues who also reported to him that when they were in his office being given a hard time about whatever they were failing at, that they should idly turn their heads and look out the window and just muse, is that clover? Clover is actually integrated into lawns natural fertilizer. It's a nitrogen-fixing plant. Used to be incorporated into seed mixes. And at the time Tuxedo Park was formed, when you were growing lawns, you were adding clover so that you didn't have to do as much. Of course, that was before the day of kind of industrial fertilizer and all those things, but still, it was just part of lawns then. Wonderful plant for bees. And so the first thing that we're doing is nothing. We're just letting the clover do its clover thing. This is a completely artificial environment, our turf grass, our lawn, right? And so clover is a beautiful addition to that completely artificial environment. It doesn't negatively impact the growth of the grass. It positively impacts the growth of the grass. That's pretty good. But we're also doing a lot of other things. So again, I showed you the stats about fertilizer and about pesticides. Well, lawns can take a lot of fertilizer and a lot of pesticides, probably more than most other parts of your average garden. And the way that we as Americans take care of our lawns really take a lot of fertilizer and water and pesticides. So we've been cutting way, way, way back, basically to nothing. But we still have about 70 acres of turf grass at NYBG, and it's still a really important part of the historic landscape design. It cannot look horrible. Because when people, they're paying $30 to come visit NYBG, and most people, when they walk through and they see a lawn that looks horrible, they're like, oh, these people don't know anything about what they're doing. I'm never coming back. And so, how do you have a lawn that doesn't look horrible, that actually looks good, without just fertilizing it and using pesticides, fungicides all the time? Well, we've been doing it just by implementing a wiser approach to mechanical care of the lawns. We cut to higher heights, 3 inches or so. We do regular aeration. We've been overseeding with tall fescues, turf grasses that don't need to be cut as often, don't need as much water, and don't have as many issues with pest and disease. And by making a denser, thicker, more biodiverse lawn clover, we're able to have the lawn compete against weeds and be generally healthy all the time. So we're not doing nothing here. We're doing a lot. It's a lot more work over time. But ultimately, the results are as good, if not better, and our impact is much, much, much less on the local environment. A rose garden. Oh my goodness. How many of you grow roses? Yeah, a lot. Well, roses are a nightmare in our climate. They really are. Black spot is a disease, a fungal disease that defoliates roses. This has been the best year for black spot in the history of years for black spot, right? And so we have a garden that is 100% roses, or 99% roses. And about 15 years ago, it was just on a chemical drip. We'd be spraying it with fungicides, we'd be spraying it with miticides, whatever, because it's been around since 1916. We have every disease and insect known to rose garden. And it just became unsustainable. It's expensive, it's complicated, and it just was unnecessary. So what we've been doing over the past, say, 15 years, since about 2007, is just experimenting with other roses. Because there's a million roses out there. And some of them are total dogs. Some of them get black spot every year. Some of them are remarkably resilient and tough plants. And actually, European rose breeders, because pesticides are illegal for ornamental horticulture throughout much of Europe, have been breeding lots of really black spot resistant, disease resistant roses that are just as beautiful and not necessarily just as fragrant. That's something they're working on now. But I would say within 5 to 10 years, your list of kind of spray-free roses is going to be so long that if you added a new rose to your garden every year for the rest of your life, you would not even scratch the surface of the rose choices out there. And you could stop spraying fungicides or greatly limit them, et cetera, et cetera.
Sorry, we're gonna take a pause and see, can we just kill the?
Yeah, we can just turn it off.
Power over there totally.
There's some interference, I think.
There we go. Yay.
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. All right. So we also have, again, we've been in the same place as an institution since 1895, and I showed you all our collections. We have plants from around the world, outside, under glass. We have every insect and disease known to horticulture. I've got to go knock on wood. We don't have a few yet, but they're on their way. If we don't have it now, we'll see it in a year or 2 or 3 or 4. So we've been experimenting with lots of different approaches to keeping these amazing plants, which are the reason why we exist, kind of healthy. And this is just a list of the sorts of things that we're doing. We're using plant amendments that actually encourage a plant's own ability to fight things off. We're using plant selection. I learned, it took me a while to learn this, we tend to be hoarders. Gardeners tend to be hoarders. I learned a while ago because we can't grow everything. Like literally, it takes the whole planet to grow everything. We're already making choices. Those choices have to do with taste, those choices have to do with program, they have to do with history. So why, in making those choices, can't we choose to grow things that are less problematic? Just as beautiful, just as interesting, but less problematic. So that's something that we've been doing. And then we're choosing to use methods of caring for those plants that do no harm. Here's something that we're trying. Weeds, we hate weeds. Again, like if we had crappy turf when people came to the garden, if there were weeds everywhere, people just would not trust us. They would not believe that we knew what we're doing. So we have been experimenting with ways of dealing with weeds, particularly in our hardscape. This is a machine called a foaming unit, which is very, again, developed in Europe. It uses basically hot water to kill weeds, and then there's a little kind of soapy stuff that allows the steam, the hot water, to stay on the weed longer. And it's been really effective for controlling weeds in hardscape. So effective that we've been experimenting by using it within planting beds as well. A way for us to manage weeds without using herbicides. There's another way. How many of you have meadows? Cole. All right, so here's a fallacy. Meadows are not easier to care for than lawns. Meadows are significantly more difficult to care for than lawns. If anyone tells you that a meadow is a self-sustaining biodiversity ecosystem, you should say, all right, thank you, I need to talk to somebody else. They're just constant work. In our environment, you walk away, this all becomes a forest. That's what our environment wants to be. Now, because of invasive species, it might not be the same forest that was here 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But in our environment, unless you have very interesting, unusual soils, either very salty, salt meadows, or with other strange chemicals in them, what you're going to have around here is a forest. So if you want a meadow, you have to manage a meadow. So we have a beautiful meadow in our native plant garden. Again, more about that in a minute. Beautifully designed, thoughtfully designed, all native plants. It takes all the time in the world to take care of it, and all of a sudden we were taking care of it all the time, but we were falling behind on mugwort. Do you guys know what mugwort is? Mugwort was, if you stood still long enough, mugwort would grow on you. And it would, and it would just suck the life out of you, as it was doing for our meadow. The problem when you have a meadow, weed control, when you have most of the plants are things that you want to keep, even if you wanted to apply herbicides, you really couldn't, because you'd be killing all the things that you want to keep. And a lot of those herbicides have a lasting effect, and it's hard to grow things back. So we're experimenting by using steam to control mugwort. So what we're doing is cutting back sections of the meadow. We apply this big heavy blanket, and they pump steam under that blanket for a while. It does kill everything, but then you can plant it right back, and you don't have any mugwort, or it's actually mugwort and bindweed was the other one that we had to, and it's been amazing. And so the reality is we might have to do this every 15 years or so. It becomes part of the approach, but at least that way we're doing something that's very mechanical and very short-lived, and we can completely change what we're doing. We don't have to worry about the long-term impacts of residual herbicides in the landscape. So again, these are all things that we're innovating, that we're thinking about, that we're learning about to try to do no harm. All right, so now we're going to go into 3 quick projects, which we're looking at maybe a larger scale, how we're addressing environmental issues at NYBG by helping to make our garden as biodiverse and beautiful and inspiring and as friendly to nature as we can. The first is Twin Lakes. I thought this would be interesting because you guys, I don't know, have a lake here that you're, I guess, thinking about, which is wonderful. So Twin Lakes is a historic component of our landscape. It's not as big and deep and glorious as Tuxedo Lake. It actually was an old swamp that had been kind of cleared and dug out in the early 1900s. There's a picture of it soon after it was completed in about 1910 or so, planted, rung around with rhododendrons, quite beautiful. But it also gets its runoff from the adjacent Allerton Avenue, Bronx Road. Here you can see after a heavy rain, all that water that fell down on the roads was working its way into the lake. And so if you look at the lake, it was just nasty. It was choked with all sorts of aquatic vegetation. And if you look at the soil profile beneath the water, it's just a kind of nasty muck that's got everything that's come down in the rain in New York over the past 130 years. And so what we've done is we've created a biofiltration basin. So basically think of it as a small lake next to the lake. That road runoff that you saw on that earlier slide comes into this area. This area is shallow. It's planted with native plants. The native plants take up a lot of the excess nutrients that are coming off the road. It's shallow and accessible, so you can get in there with a backhoe every few years and kind of scrape away the kind of the muck and things that have worked their way from the road into the system. And it's basically protecting the larger lake that is next to it. This is that basin a few years after it was completed, again, entirely with native plants. And it becomes kind of a beautiful and charming little kind of mini lake. But it's a machine. It's working on behalf of the larger lake. It's called, again, a biofiltration basin, also called a best management practice, a BMP. And we worked with the New York City DEP to design and build this, because the New York City is looking to do this sorts of thing really throughout all 5 boroughs. But where it's done most beautifully and has been done for the longest is in Staten Island, in and around Fresh Hills landscape. So literally using green infrastructure, using plants to clean water. It's been excellent. So that's Twin Lakes. We talk a little bit about our ongoing ecological restoration of that 50-acre old-growth forest. That is the reason why the garden was established on its site in the 1890s. A 50-acre old-growth forest in the middle of the Bronx, middle of New York City. Again, it was a miracle in the 19th century. If you look today, it's even that much more of a miracle. When the garden was founded, the best practices was to let Mother Nature do what Mother Nature does, stand away. So there was a policy of let alone, right? Do nothing. Mother Nature knows best. Anything we do is going to mess it up. That was the policy. Well, turns out that if you do nothing actively, but you let all the passive disturbances happen, you're actually allowing the worst things that humans can do to nature to take precedence, to win over. It became very clear that people just wandering through what was called the hemlock grove back then. It was 37% eastern hemlocks, was leading to soil compaction. People were just crushing all of the plants beneath their feet, and the hemlocks that defined the forest weren't growing back. In 1911, Elizabeth Britton, who I told you was an early advocate for the conservation of native plants, came across a school group that had dug 410 Jacks in the Pulpit, a tragedy of the commons. It's like, oh, look, they're there, they're so pretty, let's dig them up and take them back, right? And that actually was all of the rage in the early 20th century, people digging up wildflowers and using them as kind of fashion accoutrement or whatever. They were just part of life, right? So human activity was negatively impacting this forest, but yet we were still following this policy of let alone, do nothing. And then, of course, the forest was largely hemlocks. You guys have all heard of the hemlock woolly adelgid. Do you have it here?
Oh, yeah.
Another human introduction that came for us probably on the winds of Hurricane Gloria in 1985. And the hemlocks that had been declining because of these other things that we talked about were basically wiped out. There are only a few left. So by doing nothing, this forest, this old-growth forest that had been forested for thousands of years, was going to transform into something entirely else, just because we decided to do nothing. So of course, and invasive species too. We have an incredible range of invasive species. Of course, the forest is in New York City. It's also surrounded by a garden. So anytime a native plant would die, all of a sudden there's these other plants that are not from the area in the mix competing for growing space. So we saw an incredible change. In the 1890s, the forest was mostly native. By 2015, the forest is about half native, half non-native. It's pretty remarkable. So we're going after it. I call this Bronx Gothic. We started in the early 2000s just with volunteers. We had no resources, but we just had the will. And the first thing that we did is start the process of removing invasive species. It's kind of the low-hanging fruit in ecological restoration. You can see them. You have the wonderful benefit of like yanking them out of the ground, and you feel like you've done something at the end of the day. So we started to manage invasive species. And then we started to actually collect seed in the forest of native plants, grow that seed on under a greenhouse, and then plant that back into the forest. So we're actually battling this kind of inexorable tide of change that has to do with human activity by applying more or less the principles of gardening, of horticulture. We're using gardening to undo the damage that we've done to this natural system, which was the reason why the garden was established on its site. So there was an invasive species called cork tree, which is fortunately was never widely planted. But we could look, in looking at the way the forest was growing over time, we saw that if we continue to do nothing, the forest was going to go from one dominated by oaks largely to one dominated by cork tree. So we removed several hundred, about 800 cork trees from the forest. And just that action alone, and then planted native species in their place, has actually started to reverse some of that trend of negativity. And you can see it here. The point is, we haven't eradicated it. Cork tree has not gone away, but we're managing it. We're tackling it, and we're moving forward. Here is the most recent project. You guys all know knotweed. Yeah, right. Yes. So knotweed is hard to figure out. My money's on the knotweed, to be perfectly honest. But what we're doing is we're planting a lot of trees. We're cutting the knotweed back hard. You're not digging it out because it's really, really, really hard to dig out. We're just going to try to outcompete it. We're going to keep on cutting it back, plant trees. Hopefully these trees will eventually grow above the height of the knotweed, start to shade it and weaken it. And so we will still have knotweed, but we'll also have native trees, and we're kind of managing for native biodiversity. This will be the reality of much of our ecological restoration going forward. It's not the eradication of these negative human influences, it is the thoughtful management of them over time. You have to give nature a fighting chance because of what we've done to harm it over time. The native plant garden, something very different. This is about celebrating the beauty of native plants. Again, Poland High have a beautiful native plant meadow down the hill. We worked with the great landscape architect Uma van Sweden to take a garden that had been established again in the late 1930s, early 1940s to honor Elizabeth Britton, and created something that is actually a celebration of the beauty of our native plants, the horticultural beauty of our native plants. Now I made, well, what I call a quip, my daughter calls it dad joke, that back in the day, it's opened in 2013, that we wanted to take native plants from the Birkenstock set and put them into the Welly set. That's something that some of you might understand. Well, it turns out now Birkenstocks are what people who used to, it's like now, so anyway. But the point is that instead of kind of guilting people into growing native plants, instead of kind of lambasting them, we wanted to inspire them. These are beautiful, amazing, interesting plants. In England, they love our native plants. They grow them all the time. So this is what it looked like when we started. A lawn and some small kind of recreations of regional ecosystems. No one ever went in. There were great plants, great native plants here, but there wasn't anything compelling about this. It was just these plants and the stories that they told. We worked with Uma van Sweden to create a big picture of a really kind of with all the important garden features, including a water feature. Meadows, we talked about the meadow. That was a view of the meadow before we planted it. You can see we had removed some of the plants from the old native plant garden. Could you all see this? I could kind of pantomime, it's flat and dead. And we planted a lot of native meadow plants, grasses and forbs. This is in 2011, just before Hurricane Irene, if any of you remember Hurricane Irene came through. We had to manipulate the soil. We had to make the soil kind of sandier and less fertile because meadow plants tend to prefer less fertile soil, so they tell us. And that's the same view today. Again, beautiful, not without its challenges. Remember the mugwort was kind of right in the middle of that scene, but a transformation. And here are some of my favorites from this could change all the time. People ask me what my favorite child is. I don't say, well, it's not that I don't have one, it's just that it changes all the time. Same is true of native plants. These are some of my favorites: mountain mint, skullcap, of course milkweeds, and goldenrod. We also have a woodland garden. This is the way it looked in the old garden. So kind of indecipherable, right? Not so different than just the kind of any kind of ratty woodland anyway. Again, We removed a lot of the stuff there and added a lot more stuff there. This is the way it sort of works today, the Tiarella. How am I doing on time? I'm almost done. Okay. I can keep on going. So, funny story. So this is foam flower, Tiarella, and some trillium, and of course the flowering dogwood. Wonderful flowering dogwoods here. So when we planted this, this was a picture that was taken a year or two after the garden opened. It's on the cover of our NYBG coffee table book. It was so beautiful. Me and all my wisdom were like, ooh, the Tiarella is outcompeting the trillium. We should probably, trillium, which is sort of, it's kind of a fancier, plant for lack of a better, it's beautiful, interesting, native spring ephemeral, and we really wanted to have a lot of trillium in this particular view. Tiarella was doing so well. So I said, maybe we should start to thin the Tiarella out a little bit. And said, all right, okay. So we thinned the Tiarella, which mostly went away, and the trillium never came back, so the garden has completely changed. Right, so the reality is that this is a moment in time. And this was the design intent, but if you do not work with the garden that you have, the land that you have, you will be in a perpetual state of frustration and agitation. You have to work with the land that you have, and you have to read and listen to the change that's coming naturally as you are working on the land and paying attention. So here's some of my favorite woodland plants. Again, trillium, spigelia, which is a wonderful plant for kind of late spring, early summer. We have lots of ferns and sedges, which gives you kind of winter interest, including Christmas fern. And even lots of native asters, amazing native asters that do well in the woodland, the deep shade. The water feature. That's the water feature earlier. You see, is a drainage ditch down the middle of that old lawn. Again, not particularly inspiring or beautiful. We created a very sustainable system. It's the water, all the paths are permeable, so we gather rainwater and we store it in a cistern, and we use that for the makeup water. It's basically like a big fountain, like a big pool. And so we're not using potable water for the pool or for the native plant garden water feature. We're using water that's been captured. That's that system now. Quite beautiful. And I will say more than anything, and this is the reality behind garden design. Plants are beautiful and important, and of course they drive gardens. The context is also very important. And the addition of a water feature, the addition of something that you guys have here already, transforms the space. It gives people something to focus on. It's actually a very calming presence in a garden with all the busyness and chaos of the plants around it. So again, it's very, 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 very successful. Here are a handful of plants from the planting portion of the water feature from the bog, including 2 native orchids, ladies' tresses, and we even grow Sarracenia, pitcher plants, which are native to bogs in the east coast of North America. Lastly, we have a native border. So this is the whole garden, native plant garden is about 3.5 acres, and there's a lot of cool plants distributed around it, but we recognize that some people have much smaller spaces, might not be able to create big, beautiful water features and big woodland gardens, big meadows. So I call this like the greatest hits for the all-star team. These are all regionally native plants that grow in different habitats within the native plant garden that lend themselves well to a more traditional approach to horticulture. This is just a traditional kind of English border with lots of phlox, which of course is popular in England, in English borders. It's an amazing native plant. Again, here's a handful of the great plants from our native border, all of which really, the white Baptisia, the false indigo, sunflower, called lemon queen, the phlox gina, and another aster, Albomatodes, Raven's favorite. Okay, so my proselytizing has come nearly to an end. So let's sort of summarize. Like all human activity, gardening has an impact on our environment. Unlike most other human activity, within the skill set and the motivation and the sensitivity that informs gardening is the capacity to heal nature. So if you're here as a gardener, you're here with the potential to get everything you want out of gardening, whether it's control of nature, whether it's beauty, whether it's exercise, whatever it is that you want, whether it's property values, whatever it is you want out of your garden, you can get out of a garden that does no harm. No question. In fact, I would argue that once you get into doing no harm with your garden, you'll inspire it to start to use your garden to do some good by adding native plants. I would never ask anyone who's a passionate gardener to just garden with native plants. I would ask someone who's a passionate gardener to not garden with invasive plants for the reasons that I hope we've made clear. But then once you've made the transition from doing no harm to doing some good, doing good in your garden, again, you get all the benefits. Whatever your personal motivation is for gardening, you can satisfy that to the nth degree. But you've also then just turned your garden from something that is separated from the world around it to something that is profoundly improving the world around it. And how many other ways can you do that in your life? So thank you. This is the racetrack garden just down the road.
So I am going to briefly tie what Todd has been saying back to Tuxedo Park. And when we drive around, when we're in our community, most of us don't think about how steep it is. And this is a shot primarily of the west side of the lake. But you see the hillsides and how much it drops down. Gene, could you?
That looks like Yosemite.
So winter, again,
Also Yosemite.
you're getting a little more of the east side of the lake, but look at how steep the environment that we're in. So this, I know it's a bit faded here in color-wise, and at the very front desk, there are copies of this if people are interested. But all of these red, pink spots, those are ridge lines. So for example, if I pick out my house here on Mountain Farm, you can see that there's a very steep hill behind it. Here we are on ridges. So throughout our entire environment, there are ridges and steep territory. This, Todd showed us, and it's a very early, you can see that the park is, not just beginning to develop. But what I love about this picture is you really see the west side. Here's a stream, here's a stream, here's a stream. The east side, here's a stream coming in. All of those streams are bringing water down into our lake, and the steepness makes a very big difference. So whatever we put on our properties, whether we're tying directly into one of these streams, particularly given the steep terrain, the pesticides, the fertilizers, they all travel down. And they travel into Tuxedo Lake, which then goes to Pond 3, to the Weewa, and out to the Rampo, which is an important site of water for the metropolitan area. And so we are, and how do these things come down? Basically, if we do not have enough tree cover, if we do not have enough understory, there isn't an impediment to the flow coming down these really steep slopes and into our lake. And so we're asking Tuxedo gardeners to think about how the use of alternatives, the coming back and using fewer of these pesticides and fertilizers, and preserving and thinking about the appropriate amount of cutting back on trees and understory. And so while you can shift, while our water is filtered, what we drink, our lake is not. And so all of these things coming down into the lake has created a milfoil and algae problem. And so what, as Todd has very clearly pointed out, and made clear to me, we are all in the watershed. What we do wherever we are in the community is impacting what's happening to our water. And so we hope that you've taken some inspirational thoughts away. Many of you are doing your own gardening, but many of you have landscaping companies and tree companies. And so we would ask that you communicate your desires and this information and you take inspiration from this, because we live in a very special place. We have an incredible gift in our lakes, and so we need to be conscious and take inspiration from the ecologically sound approaches that are available to us to save on our tax dollars so that we don't have to work and spend money on milfoil and algae, and generally improve our own personal environment and the regional environment. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who's going to allow you to have ask questions of this wonderful resource.
Thank you again, Todd, for your informative. Thank you for your informative and inspiring talk, and thank you, Joanne, for bringing it all home. Joanne mentioned the importance of trees and understory, and one of the questions that came to us earlier asked about that, how you use the trees and understory to protect the Bronx River and New York Botanical Gardens.
Okay. Hello again. So we have maintained a forested buffer along the entire length of the Bronx River as it passes through the New York Botanical Garden, including the 50-acre old-growth forest, but even, which is right in the middle of the garden, and the river flows through the middle of it. But even to its north and south, the shores of the river, the riparian zone, the floodplain, is all forested. And what's amazing about that is that, again, the Bronx River flows through White Plains, it flows through Yonkers, it flows along the Bronx River Parkway. It has a lot of challenges. The water is cleaner when it leaves NYBG in the Bronx River than it was when it entered. It literally is the cleanest part of the entire length of the river because we have this forested buffer along the shores of the river.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that there were other questions about the storm drainage system that we have here in the park. Is Jay still here?
I am. That's me.
Oh, there you
The guy in the back.
are.
The guy in
Would
the
you
back.
want, I have your question, but would you like to ask it yourself?
Sure. We have, whatever, 4 streams, 5 streams. We have a bunch of underground streams. That is to say, we have all of these storm drains that the water goes in somewhere and it comes out at the end of a pipe or maybe nowhere else. It's relatively easy to keep the streams clean, right? We know where they are, we can be careful about what we put in them, we can be careful about how we treat them. Short of putting intercepting treatment plants at the end of every storm drain, what do you guys do to help keep the water that goes into the pipe clean?
Well, you saw that the Twin Lakes biofiltration basin, and basically the whole water feature in the native plant garden is also a biofiltration basin. So where possible, managing and maintaining wetlands, they are literally nature's water filters. Unfortunately, in the 19th century landscape that is NYBG, just as in the 19th century landscape that is Tuxedo Park, a lot of those ideas were not necessarily followed, and there's a lot of ancient and declining stormwater infrastructure at NYBG. And so where we can, this is very expensive and very disruptive to replace old stormwater infrastructure. But whenever we build a new project, we incorporate stormwater infrastructure green where possible, a biofiltration basin, but also sort of gray infrastructure that retains water and cleans it and filters it and allows it to go back into the watershed, but makes the storm surge or the high water less intense. So we use a combination of green and sort of gray infrastructure. And another way that you can do that is, again, to protect everything bit of that water as it is working its way towards those catch basins and wherever the entries are to the storm system by maintaining vegetative buffers and then just regular maintenance. But it plagues us. We have lots of clay drainage tiles, which probably you do as well, and they collapse in places where you can't find them, and it's tough. But we spend a lot of time doing that, so whenever we get the opportunity, whenever there's a construction project, stormwater is one of the first things that we think about, and we end up literally and figuratively sticking a lot of money into the ground in ways that nobody can see, because we recognize if we don't do that, the problem is just going to get worse over time, not better.
Thank you. And Jim Hayes, would you like me to read your question, or would you like to ask it? Okay. And then I'll open it up to the rest of the audience. Okay, so Jim asks about gaining the cooperation of local officials, which is always important in efforts to reduce pollutant input to waterways. What strategies have you found most effective in gaining the cooperation and support of local municipal governments?
What an excellent question. We don't live in isolation. We live within communities. We live within systems, ecological and human systems. So the first thing we do is we offer whatever help we can provide. We're a botanical garden. We have expertise. We have botanists. We have educators. And we try to share that expertise with our partners within, let's just say, the watershed. And the second thing we do is we try to practice what we preach. All the things that we just talked about right now that we've been doing in the garden, and this is really only over the past 20 years or so, gives us the credibility within that community, so that they view us as a willing partner, and not just as somebody who's telling people what they should be doing. And then lastly, but maybe it should be firstly, you have to enter into any of those conversations capable of listening, capable of hearing what your community members' problems or concerns or priorities are, and then trying to work within those concerns or those priorities to come to a mutual solution. And that's the thing I think that often institutions like ours, which have an imperial kind of reputation at least, do the least well, or we're the experts, we're going to tell you what to do. Well, the reality is we're not the experts in how they live. We're not the experts in their priorities in their lives. And we're both residents of the same planet in the same region. So going in and honestly being prepared to change our perspectives based on what we've learned from the perspectives of those partners is probably the first and most important strategy that permeates everything else.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Questions? Richard?
Hi, how worried should we be about the lanternflies, and is there anything we can do?
Well, I mean, so we got them first in 2021, and they were sort of, it was during our, we had a Kusama exhibition that year. I don't know if any of you saw the Kusama exhibition, but one thing that she's done is she wraps trees with these polka dotted fabrics. And one of the trees that we wrapped was an Ailanthus, which is their host tree, the spotted lanternfly's host tree in China. And the wrapping she uses red and white polka dots on a red thing, and and their lanternflies are polka dotted. And so there were a few years ago, isn't that interesting? And then by 2022, the next year, they were everywhere. And then this summer, not only are they everywhere, but they are very fruitful. They're very good for yellow jackets and honeybees because they produce a lot of honeydew, which is very sweet. So it's a lot of food. So we've had an explosion in all of those things. But those things also tend to attack them. There's several wasps that will attack those spotted lanternflies. And so we don't do anything. We don't kill them. I mean, everyone does. They smush them. We scrape egg casings off plants when we find them, but it's a drop in the proverbial drop in the bucket. And so what we know is we have colleagues in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia where they were coming up from the south. And what they saw in year one is they're everywhere. In year two, they're even more everywhere. And there's honeydew. But they start to sort of settle down a little bit, and they just become a part of the environment in a way. And they don't seem to do a lot of damage to garden plants or wild plants, native plants. They're most the problem, and they're of most concern for people who grow hops and vines. So if you're a vintner, then you probably have to manage them. But so far, they're just kind of everywhere, but they're not doing any damage. Yes.
And we have a healthy population of Carolina wren, and I think that they favor the spotted lanternfly as food.
Yeah,
as do
exactly.
the cardinals. They haven't eaten the elanthus
Yeah.
salad.
Right.
I actually have one question, which is just, Todd, if you could speak to the importance of leaf litter and some of the alternatives to indiscriminate leaf blowing.
Yeah, this is where you know, anybody who manages a large landscape, you know, and I love the idea. One of our scientists, one of the botanists, said to me 20 years ago. He was annoyed because someone was blowing leaves outside his office window, and he's like, "Oh, you know, in Wisconsin, he's from Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, you know, 3 strong farm boys could rake all these leaves in a matter of hours." It's like, yeah, okay, they could. We have 70 acres of turf. We use leaf blowers. We just do. We could never, if we had to rake, we would never get it done. But here's what we do: where we don't have to blow, we don't. You know, so we blow on paths, we blow in areas where if the leaves become wet or concentrated, they'll be either an aesthetic problem or a safety problem. But we are also largely forested. And even in our woodland gardens, like the native plant garden or the azalea garden, we let the leaves go. So the more of your landscape that is environment where leaves are provide a benefit, the better you are. In a small landscape, one doesn't have to blow. One can rake. It's vigorous exercise. It's lovely. And then we have been now over the past 2 years replacing as much of our internal combustion engine equipment with electric equipment. The electric equipment is a little bit less obnoxious, but not really much less obnoxious. It's still blowers.
It's significantly less polluting.
It's significant, well, of course, much less polluting, and that is an issue. But most people's concerns about leaf blowers in the common world is just how annoying they are to listen to. And so they are slightly less annoying to listen to. So it's for us, it's managing them by changing the equipment, reducing the amount of area that needs to be blown, and then also being sensitive. You know, not blowing people's offices when they're writing, science articles or whatever.
Thank you. Josh?
Thanks. So we've been looking at adding a meadow to our garden. You've now convinced me to rethink.
I don't want to be a meadow. I don't want to be a meadow detractor.
Sorry, Christopher.
I just want to be a meadow realist.
And I appreciate
Right,
that.
yeah.
But actually, you touched on something that I found really fascinating that I am considering adding, which is the clovers. You showed the picture of the clovers.
Yeah.
And you said, this is a picture of us doing nothing. But
Right.
My question for you is, those clovers didn't just show up. You must have seeded your lawn.
No, we just stopped trying to remove the clovers. Clovers everywhere. So there's a thing now that is clover lawns. Clover's a great plant for honeybees.
Okay.
Everyone loves a honeybee. So theoretically, a clover lawn or just a normal lawn that gets mowed less frequently, that is more biodiverse, including clover, but also plantains and other things that are standard turf weeds, is a meadow of sorts. It's not a native plant meadow. It's not driving pollinator habitat in the way that a planted meadow is. So I would not want to discourage anyone from making a meadow, Just know that the sorts of people who make meadows are also should be the sorts of people who have beautifully appointed homes and everything's put in its place. It's not for lazy people. it's not for people who just let things be. It's for people who are actively engaging with their gardens. It's an active engagement, not a passive engagement. Cole, am I right?
About meadows?
Yeah.
Oh my god. That's the bane of my life.
No, but see,
The
this
reward is there though.
the reward is there. So if you have the inclination, maybe what I would suggest. There are lots of different levels, right? So I showed you pictures of our meadow. It's absolutely stunningly gorgeous. And every cliche about native plants that I'd ever read, they will attract birds, they will attract dragonflies, they will attract pollinators. Literally, we would put the plant in the ground and a bee would show up or a butterfly would show up. It's all completely true. if that's the sort of thing that you want in your garden space, well, you have to work for that, right? And you work for that by adding the plants that are their food, that are their habitat, and that's a wonderful thing to do. Just don't think that you plant it, then walk away and say, this is great. You have to take care of it.
It's a wonderful experience.
Yeah, it is.
Hi, Todd. Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you.
I love water features, and I think they're very important. Unfortunately, the ones that I've tried have all turned into mosquito farms.
Right.
So, in an organic and bio way, how can I deal with that?
Right. So moving water, deep water. So that was one of the concerns about our native plant garden feature, both mosquitoes and algae. And so the way that we designed that was to have the water move, so you can't really see it, looks placid, but it's moving pretty fast. And to have as much depth as you can, to have it so we stay at depth, right? Because the mosquitoes will be, they like shallow basins of water. They love catch basins that have not been pumped out. Right. That's a great mosquito habitat. So moving water, and then attract things that eat mosquitoes. And there's a lot of things that eat mosquitoes. The number one consumer of mosquitoes, of course, is bats. So bat habitat, bat boxes, bat habitat. So again, that's an integrated approach. Just like a meadow is an integrated approach. If you're looking at just one part of the system, you're not going to be successful in getting the result that you want. But if you look at as much as you can within the space allotted, all of the aspects of the system, there are two benefits. One, you are more likely to be successful. And then two, you've just learned about the system. And you have what started off as a need for a pool, and there's lots of reasons to have a pool, became the opportunity to encourage bats. And then once you have the bats, then they're just this amazing kind of, as the sun is setting, kind of, like source of entertainment. They're great, right? And so that to me is the benefit of gardening, of the doing good part of gardening, is that you've just entered and joined a world, a living world, and you've just done what you can to enhance and support a living world. That if you're at all paying attention is just the most rewarding and inspiring thing that you can do in your life. For me, but remember, I am a tree-hugging fanatic.
Thank you so much, Todd. Great talk.
Yeah.
Just want to say Pierre Laurelard's ears would be ringing with his wonderful presentation about his property in the Bronx and the property here. But there's one word that Todd said that would, I think, make him so happy, and us as well. It's green and grey infrastructure.
Right.
There's a plan in downtown Tuxedo of revitalizing and beautifying our little town there with trees and pocket parks to attract businesses there. So we have the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all the things that we need. And so Michelle, could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, well, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, we have a plan, we're planning to plan a downtown of our historic hamlet to bring in landscaping and lighting and little pocket parks, which after meeting with the Department of Transportation, we're learning they're very supportive of, because it's streetscapes is something that they really support, and they think that streetscapes then bring many benefits such as traffic calming and health benefits for having trees in the downtown area. So we had a presentation Monday night. It's available on tpfyi.com and on the town of Tuxedo's website, tuxedogov.org. And we'd love to have your feedback on the preliminary plans we've presented. There's a questionnaire that you can submit to the town clerk that will help us incorporate your feedback into making those plans become a reality. So,
great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you can ask me that afterwards if you have any questions about it.
Any other questions? Jim?
It looks as if your herbaceous borders along the Bronx River have been successful. in terms of filtering out anything that might be coming. Do you have any thought on what the secret of that success is? The width of these borders, and you must maintain them, I suppose, the same way you'd maintain a meadow.
Well, our sort of green infrastructure, which protects the Bronx River, but the Twin Lakes green infrastructure and the native plant garden is site specific. It's a range of native plants. It's not the world of native plants. Those sorts of things in those sorts of areas that might not receive as much attention as other parts of our garden. We like to plant native thugs. Things that run, things like goldenrod, which can take over a garden. If you plant Canada goldenrod just in a normal border, you're going to have nothing but Canada goldenrod. But in a place that's designed to just be kind of wild and kind of like a working landscape, that and various milkweeds and some of the native grasses are really wonderful options. Mostly along the river, the way that we protect the river itself is mostly